It was an early Tuesday morning when Officer Mike Bennett drove down the quiet streets of Glenwood, a small, sleepy town nestled just beyond the city. The town was one of those places where people rarely locked their doors, neighbors waved at each other from across the road, and every face was familiar. For Mike, it was the perfect assignment, routine, predictable, and peaceful. He had worked in busier precincts before, places filled with constant noise and chaos, but Glenwood felt like a break. A place where he could breathe. But this particular morning didn't feel the same. As Mike cruised past Willow Park, the fog of early morning still lingering on the edges of the grass, he noticed something unusual: a woman walking a dog. She wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. She strolled casually, the dog, a shaggy mutt, sniffing the ground enthusiastically. But something about her caught his eye. Maybe it was her posture, straight and self-assured, unlike most early risers who shuffled around with half-lidded eyes and tired steps. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, her movements deliberate, as though she knew exactly where she was going and didn't care what anyone thought about it. Or maybe it was the simple fact that Mike didn't recognize her. In Glenwood, not recognizing someone stood out like a sore thumb. Mike slowed his patrol car to a crawl, his eyes narrowing. The woman looked to be in her mid-30s, dressed in faded jeans, a plain hoodie, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she wore no makeup. Everything about her appearance screamed average, but Mike felt a nagging instinct in the back of his mind. She didn't belong here, or at least, that's what his gut told him. He pulled the car over to the curb and rolled down his window. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" The woman stopped mid-step, turning to face him. Her dog, oblivious to the tension in the air, wagged its tail and barked once, as if greeting the officer. "I'm walking my dog," she replied evenly, her voice calm. "Is that a problem, officer?" Mike studied her closely. Her eyes were sharp, piercing even, with a confidence that caught him off guard. She didn't seem nervous or defensive, just steady. It was an odd thing to notice, but it unsettled him. Most people, when stopped by a cop, fumbled with their words or over-explained themselves. This woman didn't. "No problem," Mike said, though his tone didn't match his words. "Just wondering if you're visiting someone around here. Don't think I've seen you before." The woman raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I didn't realize I needed to know everyone in town to walk my dog." Mike's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure if her comment was meant to be cheeky or if she was just stating a fact, but it didn't sit well with him. "Glenwood's a small town," he said, his voice slightly sharper now. "We don't get many strangers passing through." "Well, I'm not exactly passing through," she said. Mike waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the dog's leash and glanced at her watch, as though this conversation was mildly inconveniencing her. "Mind if I see some ID?" Mike asked. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, amusement, perhaps. Without hesitation, she reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a slim wallet. She handed him her driver's license, her movements slow and deliberate. "Rebecca Hayes," Mike read aloud. He glanced at her face, then back at the ID. The photo matched, and the address listed wasn't local, it was from the city, about 50 miles away. "What brings you to Glenwood, Ms. Hayes?" he asked, still holding onto the license. Rebecca met his gaze, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Just needed some fresh air," she said simply. "Fresh air," Mike repeated, skepticism lacing his words. "We don't usually get visitors this time of year. Not much going on in Glenwood." She shrugged. "Sometimes, quiet is exactly what you need." Mike stared at her for a moment longer, trying to read between the lines of her response. She wasn't acting suspicious, not really. But something about her still felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, and that only made him more determined to figure it out. "Do you mind telling me where you're staying?" he asked, handing her ID back. Rebecca tucked the license away and smiled faintly. "Not far." That was it. No specific address, no explanation, just two words that left Mike with more questions than answers. "Not far, huh?" he said, his tone a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Not far," she repeated, as though daring him to press further. Mike clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to people being so vague, especially not in Glenwood. Most folks here were overly friendly, quick to explain their business even when no one asked. But Rebecca Hayes didn't fit that mold. "Well, Ms. Hayes," he said finally, "enjoy your walk. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call the station." "Thanks, officer," she said, her tone polite but with a hint of sarcasm. As she turned and continued down the street, her dog trotting happily beside her, Mike sat in his patrol car, watching her go. That uneasy feeling in his gut hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. Who was this woman? Why was she here? And why did he feel like there was more to her story than she was letting on? The quiet morning felt less peaceful now, and for the first time in a long while, Mike wondered if Glenwood was about to become anything but predictable. That afternoon, Mike's phone rang. It was Ramirez, his partner. "Hey, Mike, got a minute?" Ramirez asked, his voice a little more serious than usual. "Sure, what's up?" "There's something you should know," Ramirez said, his tone lowering. "I did a little digging last night." Mike sat up straighter, his heart rate picking up. "Digging? About what?" "Rebecca Hayes," Ramirez said. "I was curious about her too, and I found something interesting." Mike's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What'd you find?" Ramirez hesitated for a moment before answering. "She's not just some random woman from the city. She's, well, let's just say, she's a lot more than she's letting on." Mike's mind raced. "What do you mean? Who is she?" "She's a big deal," Ramirez said, his voice almost in awe. "She's the CEO of a major tech company, Global Innovations. They're huge. Billions of dollars in revenue. The whole company's known for cutting-edge technology, and she's one of the youngest CEOs in the world." Mike's jaw dropped. "Wait, you're saying the woman I stopped yesterday is the CEO of Global Innovations?" "Yep," Ramirez confirmed. "I couldn't believe it either. She's kept a pretty low profile, though. Doesn't do interviews, avoids the spotlight. But she's a big player in the business world." Mike felt his head spin. "No way. That's insane." "So, here's the thing," Ramirez continued. "I don't know why she's in Glenwood, but it's not just a casual visit. This woman's got serious connections. And if she's here, it's for a reason." Mike's mind was racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make any sense. Why would someone like Rebecca Hayes come to a tiny, quiet town like Glenwood? And why would she act so normal? So average? "What do you think we should do?" Mike asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. "We keep an eye on her," Ramirez said. "Find out what she's really doing here. If she's here for business, it could mean something big. And if she's here for something else..." Mike's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Hang on, Ramirez," Mike said. He turned toward the door and saw his captain standing in the doorway. "Mike," Captain Harris said, his voice low. "We've got a situation." Mike's stomach dropped. "What's going on, sir?" "We've had a report," Captain Harris continued, glancing at the papers in his hand. "There's been a string of break-ins in the area. Nothing major, but it's unusual for Glenwood. And it's got the mayor worried. He wants us to step up patrols and keep an eye on things. Mike felt a sense of urgency settle in. When did this happen? Last night, the captain replied. And it's not just the break-ins. There's been some strange activity near Willow Park. People report seeing unfamiliar cars parked around, but no one's sure who they belong to. Mike's mind went immediately to Rebecca. Could she be connected to this somehow? It didn't seem likely. But then again, he had no idea who she really was. I'll keep my eyes peeled, sir, Mike said. Good, Captain Harris said. We need to be vigilant. Keep your head on a swivel, Bennett. As the captain left the room, Mike's phone buzzed. It was a text from Ramirez. Ramirez, we need to talk. Meet me at Willow Park in 30 minutes. Mike quickly grabbed his jacket. Something was about to happen, and he wasn't sure what, but he was determined to find out. Mike Bennett stood there, eyeing Rebecca Hayes carefully as she adjusted the leash on her dog, the scruffy mutt tugging at the end of the line. He couldn't shake the sense that something about her wasn't right, something that didn't quite fit. She was calm, too calm, and that bothered him. He studied her for a few more seconds, trying to figure out what had set him off. It wasn't just her presence that made him uneasy. It was the way she carried herself, the way she stood in front of him, as if she was completely in control of the situation. The quiet confidence radiating from her made him feel like he was missing something important, and that feeling gnawed at him. Mike cleared his throat and spoke again. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, he said, his voice now a bit more authoritative, as he shifted his weight slightly. Mind showing me some ID? Rebecca let out a quiet sigh, the kind of sigh that suggested she had expected this. Without missing a beat, she reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out her wallet, handing over her ID without any hesitation. Mike took it from her, glancing at the card for a moment before reading it aloud. Rebecca Hayes, he muttered to himself. The name felt vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. He looked her over again, still feeling a growing sense of suspicion. There was something about her that didn't add up, something about her calm demeanor, the way she had handled his questions, like she had anticipated this all along. He glanced down at the address on her ID, an address from the city, a good 50 miles away from Glenwood. What brings you to this neighborhood? He asked, his tone still sharp, probing. Just visiting, Rebecca replied, her voice calm and measured, as if the answer should have been enough. But it didn't satisfy Mike. Not by a long shot. Visiting who? Mike pressed, his brow furrowing. Do they live around here? Rebecca didn't immediately answer, and Mike noticed her pause. For a split second, she seemed to be weighing her words, her lips pressing together in a tight line before she spoke again. I don't see how that's any of your business, officer, she said, her tone polite but firm. Mike's frustration began to rise. He had asked simple, reasonable questions, and yet all he got in return was vague answers. He wasn't used to this. In a small town like Glenwood, people were usually open and straightforward. There was no need for this level of evasiveness, and it irritated him more than he cared to admit. Ma'am, Mike said, keeping his tone steady but firm, I'm going to need you to come down to the station for questioning. His words were clipped, the decision made. He wasn't going to let her brush him off this time. Rebecca's eyes flickered briefly, but she didn't react with anger or resistance. Instead, she simply raised an eyebrow. There was no sense of fear or anxiety in her expression, which only deepened Mike's suspicion. Most people, when confronted with the possibility of being questioned at the station, would react with some form of surprise, hesitation, or at least a little protest. But not Rebecca. She simply stood there, looking almost amused. Okay, she said, her voice cool and collected. Lead the way. Mike frowned, momentarily thrown by her calm response. She wasn't what he expected at all. But he wasn't going to let that throw him off. Without saying another word, he motioned for her to follow him to his patrol car. Rebecca bent down to pick up the leash, her dog wagging its tail excitedly, oblivious to the tension in the air. She clipped the leash onto the dog's collar and gave Mike a glance that was so subtle, so quick, that Mike almost didn't catch it. It was a small gesture, just a glance, but it was enough to make him feel like she knew something he didn't. He turned away, heading toward his patrol car, and Rebecca followed without hesitation, her footsteps quiet on the pavement. As Mike slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back, her dog resting at her feet, perfectly calm and composed. He couldn't help but feel that the situation was growing more complicated by the second. She wasn't acting like someone who had just been pulled over in a small town. "Why Glenwood?" Mike asked, his voice reflecting the frustration that had been building inside him since the moment he first saw her. "Why come all the way here? This isn't exactly a tourist hotspot." Rebecca didn't immediately respond, and Mike felt the tension between them grow thicker. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and even. "I'm just passing through," she said, her tone so calm that it almost sounded rehearsed. Mike didn't buy it. He knew there was more to this than she was letting on, but at the moment, he had no proof, just a gut feeling that was telling him to dig deeper. The drive to the station was short, but to Mike, it felt like it stretched on forever. Every minute that passed only deepened his unease. By the time they arrived at the small police station, Mike's mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle that was Rebecca Hayes. As they stepped out of the car, Mike led her into the station, his steps heavy with the weight of the unanswered questions. Inside, the building was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Mike guided Rebecca into an interrogation room, a small, sterile space with a metal table and 2 chairs. He gestured for her to sit, and she did so without protest, the dog sitting at her feet as if it were a trained service animal. "Please, have a seat," Mike said, his tone still firm, but with a hint of weariness now creeping into his voice. "We'll just ask a few questions, and then we'll let you go." Rebecca nodded, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She didn't seem fazed by the situation at all. In fact, she looked almost entirely at ease. It was as if this wasn't her first time being questioned. That realization hit Mike like a ton of bricks, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. What was he dealing with here? "I'm just trying to understand why you're here," Mike began again, trying to keep his voice neutral. "There's been some unusual activity around Willow Park. Unfamiliar cars, odd behaviors. Your visit, it just doesn't add up." Rebecca tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words. "I don't know anything about unfamiliar cars or odd behavior," she said, her tone still cool and composed. "I'm just here to walk my dog. Nothing more." Mike's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he held it in check. He wasn't going to let her get away with this vague nonsense any longer. "Who exactly are you visiting here in Glenwood?" he asked again, his voice tight with irritation. "Who's in this town that you're just visiting?" Rebecca's lips parted slightly, her expression unchanging. She didn't answer right away, and Mike could see her weighing her options. She could lie, she could stay quiet, or she could tell the truth. But either way, Mike had the feeling that she wasn't going to make this easy. Finally, she looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I told you already," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm just visiting. That's all you need to know." And there it was again, the cold, deliberate distance in her words. It was becoming clear to Mike that Rebecca wasn't going to crack. Whatever secrets she was hiding, she wasn't about to share them willingly. And that made him even more determined to uncover the truth. Mike sat back in his chair, staring at her for a long moment. "We'll see about that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. But in that moment, Mike knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just another quiet day in Glenwood. Something bigger was at play, and whether Rebecca Hayes was a part of it or not, Mike Bennett was determined to find out what it was. "Feel like you know something about it?" Mike's voice was steady, though inside, his heart was pounding. Rebecca sat there, silent, her face a mask of calm. She wasn't cracking, not even slightly. Mike leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, but she didn't react to his words. "Don't take me for a fool, Rebecca," Mike continued, his voice low. "I've been a cop in this town long enough to know when something feels off. And right now, this feels off." Rebecca's eyes flickered, but it was impossible to tell whether she was concerned or just getting bored. Her expression remained unreadable. "I'm not hiding anything from you," she finally said, her tone just as flat as before. "I'm here because I'm visiting, just like I said. If you don't believe me, that's on you." Mike had to admit this wasn't going the way he expected. She wasn't giving him anything to work with. No signs of fear, no signs of guilt, just that calm, composed attitude that made her seem more like a chess player than a suspect. He sat back, running a hand over his jaw. "You don't make it easy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His eyes darted to the door, wondering if he should call for backup. Maybe he needed a second opinion, someone who might see what he was missing. But even as he thought it, he realized that Rebecca was still the most important piece on the board. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy. Mike could feel the tension building. It wasn't just about the break-ins anymore. Something bigger was at play here, and he was certain Rebecca knew more than she was letting on. Finally, he stood up abruptly, making Rebecca look up in surprise. "Fine," Mike said, "I'm going to go make a call. You sit tight." He turned to leave the room, his mind still racing with possibilities. There was something she wasn't saying, something hidden beneath the surface. But what? Rebecca didn't respond, not even a glance in his direction. She simply remained still, her dog resting quietly at her feet. As Mike stepped into the hallway, he glanced around. The station was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual bustle of officers, phones ringing, and the hum of the radio were all absent. He walked over to the desk and picked up the phone, dialing the number for his captain. The phone rang once, twice. Finally, the line clicked, and Captain Harris's voice came on the other end. "Bennett, what's going on?" Harris asked. "I've got a situation," Mike replied, keeping his voice low. "There's a woman in here, Rebecca Hayes. She's odd, to say the least. She's calm, composed, and she's got this strange air about her. I think she's hiding something, and it's not just about the break-ins. But she's not giving me anything. I need a second opinion." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Mike could almost hear Harris's frown. "All right, I'll send someone down. But you're sure this isn't just a misunderstanding? Could be an innocent person just passing through." Mike rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't think so. Something's off. I'll be here." "All right. Keep me posted." The line went dead, and Mike set the phone back in its receiver, his mind still spinning. He needed to find out what Rebecca was hiding, and he needed to do it fast. He walked back into the interrogation room, his steps heavier now, his mind made up. He couldn't let her keep playing these games. Rebecca was still sitting there, unmoving. Mike took his seat across from her again, but this time, something had shifted. He wasn't going to let her control the room. He wasn't going to let her stay calm and collected while he tried to pull answers out of her. No. This time, he would push harder. "All right, Rebecca," Mike began, his voice more forceful. Let's cut the games. I know you're not telling me everything. And I'm done being polite. Rebecca raised an eyebrow, her lips curling slightly, but she didn't speak. I'm going to ask you again, Mike continued, leaning forward. Who are you visiting? Why are you really here? Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her expression flickering with something, maybe annoyance, maybe impatience, but still, she didn't speak. Mike could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him. It was as if she was daring him to push harder. Fine, Mike muttered, getting to his feet again. He wasn't about to give up. He needed answers, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get them. But as he turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The door to the interrogation room swung open, and another officer stepped inside. Officer Lana Matthews, a young cop who had been with the department for a few years. Mike, Lana said, her voice soft but urgent. You need to see this. Mike looked at her, confused, but followed her out of the room without a word. Lana led him down the hallway, her steps quick. She stopped outside the station's small evidence room, where the files were kept. What's going on? Mike asked, his mind still spinning from his interaction with Rebecca. Lana handed him a file, one he hadn't seen before. Mike flipped it open, scanning the contents. His heart dropped as he read the name at the top. Rebecca Hayes, he muttered. But it wasn't just her name. There were pictures too. Mike's eyes widened as he recognized the images. They were taken in a luxury office building, and in one of the photos, there she was, Rebecca, standing at a large desk, speaking with a group of high-profile executives. She's not just some visitor, Mike whispered under his breath, his mind racing. She's someone important. Someone big. Lana nodded, her face grim. She's the CEO of a major tech company. They've been under investigation for months. We just didn't know she was in town. Mike's head was spinning. How had he missed this? Why didn't she mention it? He felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary visit. Rebecca Hayes wasn't just a passerby, she was someone powerful, someone who had been keeping a low profile for a reason. She's got something to do with the break-ins, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lana nodded. I think so. But what, exactly, is the question? Mike's mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. This wasn't just about stolen goods or petty theft. There was something much bigger going on, and Rebecca Hayes, it seemed, was at the center of it all. He had been right to feel that something was off about her. But now the question was, what was she hiding, and why was she in Glenwood? Mike stared at her, trying to read her expression. There was something about her calm demeanor, the way she sat so relaxed, that made him feel uneasy. Most people would be at least a little shaken in a situation like this, but Rebecca wasn't. It was as though she had been through this kind of thing 100 times before. I'm going to ask you again, Mike said, his voice low. What brings you to Glenwood? We don't have many visitors around here. And we've been having some issues lately. People breaking into houses. Suspicious activity near Willow Park. I don't think you're just here to walk your dog. Rebecca didn't flinch at his words. She simply continued to look at him with that calm, almost knowing gaze. You can ask me as many times as you want, Mike. But I'm not going to give you the answers you're hoping for. Mike's patience was starting to wear thin. He paced the small room, running a hand through his hair as he tried to figure out his next move. Something about her felt too composed, too in control. It was like she was playing some kind of game, and he didn't know the rules. Do you always treat people like this? She asked, breaking the silence. You just assume everyone is guilty until proven innocent. Mike paused, turning to face her. There it was again, the same confident, almost smug tone. She wasn't scared of him. and that was starting to get under his skin. "I'm doing my job," he replied, his voice tight. "And right now, it's my job to figure out why you're here and what you're really up to." Rebecca smiled faintly, like she found something amusing. "Mike, you don't have to do this. I've been completely honest with you from the start." Mike took a deep breath, trying to regain his focus. He needed something. Anything that would help him figure out what she was hiding. "You keep saying that, but you haven't given me much to work with. You're not a tourist. You don't just show up in a town like this with no reason. So what's the real story?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she shifted slightly in her chair, her dog's head lifting for a moment before resting again. She was completely at ease, while Mike felt like he was spiraling in circles, chasing a truth that seemed to slip further out of his reach the more he tried to grasp it. "You're right," Rebecca finally said, her voice soft but deliberate. "I'm not a tourist. But I'm also not a criminal. You want to know the truth, Mike? The truth is, I'm here because I have business to attend to. And no, I'm not going to tell you what it is." Mike took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Why not? What's so important that you can't share?" Rebecca didn't even flinch at his approach. She just looked at him, that same unreadable expression on her face. "Because it's none of your business." Mike was taken aback by her bluntness. Most people would try to defend themselves, explain why they were innocent. But Rebecca wasn't playing by any of the usual rules. She wasn't trying to convince him. She was just existing, unbothered, and distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding back something huge. Something that could change everything. "Look," Mike said, trying to regain control of the situation, "we don't need to do this the hard way. I'm just trying to help you. If you cooperate, this will all be over soon." Rebecca's lips curled into a faint smile again. "Help me? You think you're helping me by sitting here, interrogating me like I'm some kind of criminal?" Mike clenched his jaw, feeling a wave of frustration wash over him. "I'm trying to figure out what you're really up to, Rebecca. I'm trying to make sense of all this." Rebecca didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to the window for a moment, her eyes distant. She seemed deep in thought, as if considering whether or not to say more. "I'm not hiding anything," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "But I know you're not going to believe that." Mike looked at her, his skepticism thick in the air. "Then why won't you just tell me the truth?" Rebecca met his gaze once more. "Because the truth doesn't matter. Not to you. Not to anyone in this town. Not yet, anyway." Her words stung, hitting Mike harder than he cared to admit. He was used to getting the truth out of people. He was used to getting answers, no matter how hard they fought. But Rebecca wasn't like anyone he had dealt with before. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of anything. And that scared him more than he wanted to admit. The silence between them stretched again. The seconds ticked by like hours. Mike could feel his frustration building, but he also knew he needed to be careful. He was getting closer to something, he could feel it. There was something more to Rebecca Hayes than she was letting on. He had to push, but not too hard. He couldn't afford to let her slip through his fingers. He turned away from her, pacing again, but his mind was focused, piecing together the small bits of information he had. She was connected to something bigger, he was sure of it. But what? As he turned back to face her, Mike asked, "You really want me to believe that you're here on business, and it's none of my concern?" In a town like this, where the biggest scandal is a lost cat, people don't just show up with no reason. Rebecca looked up at him, a flash of something in her eyes. It was subtle, but Mike caught it, a momentary flicker of vulnerability before she quickly masked it again. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't as untouchable as she wanted him to think. "You're right," she said after a long pause. "But sometimes, Mike, people have to protect their own interests. And if you're smart, you'll understand that." He could feel the tension in the room grow heavier. Her words were cryptic, layered with meaning, and yet, she wasn't giving him anything solid. Every time he thought he was getting closer, she pulled away, retreating back into the armor of her calm composure. It was maddening. Mike didn't know why, but he felt like she was trying to warn him about something. But what? "All right, I'm done with the games," Mike said, his voice hardening. "If you're not going to tell me, I'll find out another way. You can't hide the truth forever." Rebecca's lips curved into that same small smile, and for the first time, Mike felt a chill run down his spine. He had the distinct feeling that she knew exactly how this was going to end. And it wasn't going to be the way he expected. As the door to the interrogation room clicked open, Mike realized he was getting in way over his head. And Rebecca Hayes, with all her mysterious calm and cryptic words, was at the center of it all. Whatever she was hiding, it wasn't just about her. It was something bigger. Something that could change everything. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and Mike could feel it vibrating through the walls, the air thick with uncertainty. Rebecca Hayes sat perfectly still, her dog's soft breathing the only sound breaking the silence. Her eyes never left Mike as he paced, each step more purposeful than the last. There was something about her presence so calm, so collected that made Mike uneasy. She wasn't playing the game like most suspects. She was playing by her own rules, and that made her dangerous. Mike's mind raced as he tried to put the pieces together. Why was she here? Why had she been so evasive? And why wasn't she cracking under pressure? Most people would be sweating by now, pleading their innocence or breaking down from the fear of the unknown. But not Rebecca. She was calm, almost too calm. Mike's frustration was building, but there was something else too, a sense that she was controlling the situation, even though he was the one asking the questions. He stopped pacing and turned back to face her, his jaw clenched. "You don't make it easy, you know that." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. She wasn't mocking him, not exactly, but it was clear she didn't feel the same urgency that Mike did. "Tell me this, Rebecca," Mike said, his voice low and deliberate. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the start? Why all the secrecy?" Rebecca's smile faded, and for a brief moment, she looked almost resigned. As if she knew this was the moment where the conversation would shift. "I didn't think you would believe me if I did," she said softly, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Sometimes, the truth is more dangerous than the lie." Mike raised an eyebrow. That was a curious response. "What are you talking about?" Rebecca met his gaze, her eyes steady, unflinching. "You're looking for something, Mike. I can see it in your eyes. But you don't even know what you're looking for. You're chasing shadows, hoping you'll catch something that makes sense." Mike's heart skipped a beat. There it was again, the sense that she knew something he didn't. She wasn't just a random woman passing through Glenwood. She was something more, something deeper. And he had to know what it was. "So tell me," Mike said, his voice tightening with urgency, "what is it you're hiding? What's the real reason you're here?" Rebecca's eyes softened, but there was no hint of fear or panic. "I'm not hiding anything from you, Mike. Not the way you think. I just don't think you're ready to hear it." Mike felt a rush of anger flood his chest. He was done with this cryptic nonsense. He wasn't going to let her keep playing him like this. "I'm done with the games, Rebecca. Either you start talking, or I'll make you talk." She tilted her head slightly, her expression still unreadable. "You don't understand, do you?" she said quietly. You think you're in control. But you're not. Not yet. Mike clenched his fists, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He could tell she was toying with him now, pushing his buttons, trying to provoke a reaction. He had to stay calm. He couldn't let her win. Fine, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then let me give you a little taste of reality. If you think you're above this, if you think you're untouchable, you're wrong. You're not the one in charge here. Rebecca's eyes flickered with something amusement. Annoyance. It was hard to tell. But she didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked down at her dog, who had started to stir in her lap, and gently stroked its fur, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. Mike felt the silence stretch between them, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He had no idea how much longer he could hold his ground. He needed something. Anything. And then, just as he was about to speak again, the door to the interrogation room opened. Officer Ramirez stepped inside, looking slightly out of breath, his face serious. "Mike," Ramirez said, his tone urgent, "we've got a problem." Mike turned toward him, his frustration boiling over. "What is it now?" Ramirez stepped forward, holding up a folder in his hands. "I think you need to see this." Mike frowned and walked over to Ramirez, taking the folder from him. As he flipped it open, his eyes scanned the contents quickly. The first thing he saw was a photograph of Rebecca, taken from a distance, standing outside a large building. The building was unfamiliar to Mike, but there was something in the image that made his pulse quicken. "Where did you get this?" Mike asked, looking up at Ramirez, his tone sharp. "I had our tech guys run a background check," Ramirez explained. "Turns out, she's not just some tourist. Rebecca Hayes is the CEO of a tech company based in Silicon Valley. She's connected to some pretty big names, Mike. And I think she's in town for a reason." Mike's mind was spinning. A CEO? That was something he hadn't expected. It explained the calm confidence, the unshakable composure. But it didn't explain why she was in Glenwood or what her connection was to the recent break-ins. He glanced back at Rebecca, who was still sitting quietly, her dog resting in her lap. She hadn't reacted to the news, didn't seem surprised at all. In fact, she seemed almost pleased. "Rebecca," Mike said, his voice low and commanding, "you've been hiding something from me. I know you have. Why are you really here?" Rebecca looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a kind of knowing intensity. "I told you before, Mike. I'm here for business. But you wouldn't believe me if I told you the truth. You're looking for answers that don't exist in the way you think they do." Mike's frustration flared again. "You're not making any sense. Business? What kind of business? What does a tech CEO like you have to do with this small town?" Rebecca leaned back in her chair, looking almost bored. "You're still thinking too small. This town, these people, they're just pawns in a much bigger game. You've been chasing ghosts, Mike. And that's the truth you're not ready for." Mike stared at her, his mind racing. She was saying something important, something he wasn't understanding. He needed to break through whatever walls she had built around herself, but how? "Tell me everything," Mike demanded, his voice hard. Rebecca didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply looked at him with that same calm, steady gaze. "It's not that simple, Mike. You can't just rush through the answers and expect to understand. It's bigger than you think. And you're not ready to know how deep this goes." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. What was she talking about? What kind of business was she involved in that could be so important, so dangerous, that she had to lie about it? He glanced at the folder again, but the photo of Rebecca standing outside the building seemed to mock him now. The building looked familiar, like it was connected to something. Something he just couldn't place. Enough games, Mike said, his patience finally breaking. You've had your fun. Now, you're going to tell me what you're really up to, or I'll make you talk. Rebecca raised an eyebrow, as if amused by his threat. You don't scare me, Mike. And you won't get what you want from me. Not yet, anyway. The words hung in the air between them like a weight. Rebecca wasn't just a CEO. She wasn't just a visitor in town. She was connected to something far bigger, something Mike couldn't yet see. And if he didn't figure it out soon, this whole situation could spiral out of control. He was starting to understand he wasn't the one in charge here. Rebecca was. And that was exactly what terrified him. Mike felt a wave of humiliation wash over him as he stood there, holding the file in his hands. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. This wasn't just some random woman, this was Rebecca Hayes, the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the world. She was a self-made billionaire, known for her sharp business acumen and reclusive nature. The fact that he had been questioning her like a common criminal made him sick to his stomach. Ms. Hayes, I owe you an apology, Mike said, his voice faltering. He had hoped the apology would sound sincere, but the weight of his mistake was too heavy to mask. He had misjudged her, and now it was clear he had no idea who he was dealing with. Rebecca didn't react right away. She simply put her phone down on the table, folding her hands neatly in front of her. Her eyes were still as piercing as ever, but there was something else there now, something that made Mike feel small. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was disappointment. And it stung more than any outburst could have. For assuming I didn't belong, she said, her voice cool, but there was a hint of irony in her tone. Or for forgetting that appearances can be deceiving. Mike opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to that? She was right. He had been so quick to judge her based on her appearance. She had dressed casually, walked with confidence, and didn't seem to fit the mold of the typical business mogul. But now, standing before her, he realized how wrong he had been. I didn't know who you were, Mike said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I didn't mean to. I didn't realize. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice calm and controlled. I know you didn't, Mike. And that's the problem. You were too quick to judge me based on what I looked like. You saw me, and all you saw was a woman walking her dog in a quiet neighborhood, someone who didn't belong. But you never stopped to think, what if the truth was more complicated? Mike couldn't meet her gaze. She was right again. He had never stopped to think, to question his assumptions. He had let his instincts guide him, and now, in the face of this revelation, he realized how much he had missed. I'm sorry, he repeated, his voice strained. I never should have treated you like that. It wasn't right. Rebecca's expression softened just a fraction. Apologies are easy, Mike. But understanding is harder. Do you know why I'm here? Mike looked up at her, unsure of what to say. Was she here for business? Was there something else going on? All of the questions that had been swirling in his mind were now amplified, racing through his thoughts. I don't know, Mike admitted. You're a billionaire. A CEO. Why would you be in a small town like this? Rebecca's eyes flickered with something, maybe amusement, maybe something else. I'm here because of a project. A very important project. Something that could change everything for my company. And for the people who live here. Mike frowned. What kind of project? Rebecca paused, her gaze drifting toward the window. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. A project that's been in the works for months. Something my company has been developing in secret. But it's not just about tech. It's about power. About control. About making sure that the right people have the tools to shape the future. Mike felt a shiver run down his spine. What does that have to do with Glenwood? With this town? Rebecca's eyes snapped back to his. You still don't get it, do you? Glenwood isn't just some quiet town. There's more going on here than you can imagine. The people who live here, they're connected to the tech world, to the future of the economy, to everything. Mike's head was spinning. He had no idea what she was talking about. How could a small town like Glenwood be connected to anything bigger than itself? And why was she involving herself in it? Who are you really? Mike asked, his voice rising with frustration. Why are you here? What's your real purpose in Glenwood? Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. I'm here because I have a responsibility to the future. And that means doing things that people won't always understand. But they'll see. Eventually. Mike shook his head, still trying to make sense of it all. I don't understand. You're talking in circles. What are you planning? What do you want from this town? Rebecca's expression hardened, and for the first time, Mike saw a flicker of something dangerous in her eyes. I'm not asking for anything from this town. This isn't about what I want. It's about what's necessary. What has to be done? The room seemed to close in on him. He felt like he was in over his head, like he had stumbled into a situation far bigger than anything he could have imagined. All the assumptions he had made, all the judgments he had passed, had been wrong. He wasn't dealing with an ordinary person. He was dealing with someone who had power, who had a plan, and who wasn't afraid to use whatever means necessary to achieve her goals. You're not going to stop me, Mike, Rebecca continued, her voice steady and resolute. No matter how hard you try. You don't have the resources, the knowledge, or the connections to stop what's coming. But I'm giving you a choice. You can walk away now, forget everything that's happened here, and let things unfold as they will. Or, you can try to stop me, and risk everything you've ever known. Mike swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced with questions, with doubts. He had no idea what she was talking about, but the gravity of the situation was clear. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding or a case of mistaken identity. This was bigger, much bigger. Why are you telling me this? Mike asked, his voice low. Why are you giving me this choice? Rebecca's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Because, Mike, in the end, it's always about the choices we make. You have your path, and I have mine. I'm giving you the opportunity to decide which one you want to take. But make no mistake, I will do what I need to do. With or without your approval. For a long moment, Mike stood frozen in the room, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was clear, Rebecca Hayes wasn't just a tech CEO. She wasn't just a woman walking her dog. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose plans stretched far beyond the small town of Glenwood. And now, Mike Bennett had to decide whether he would be a part of her future or whether he would stand in her way. Mike's mind raced as he processed everything Rebecca had just said. The words echoed in his head. You don't have the resources, the knowledge, or the connections to stop what's coming. She wasn't just speaking figuratively. She was talking about something far beyond what Mike could comprehend. The world of tech, power, and influence that she moved in was completely outside his reality. For a moment, he wanted to brush it all off, to walk out of the room and pretend this never happened. Maybe Rebecca Hayes was just some powerful woman with delusions of grandeur. But something in the way she spoke, calm, collected, yet so assured, told Mike that she wasn't lying. She wasn't playing games. Mike could feel his pulse quickening as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He had spent his entire career in a small, quiet town where things didn't change much. His work was routine patrols, the occasional traffic stop, and dealing with small-town disputes. But this was something he could never have prepared for. Something that could shift the course of his life, his career, and maybe even his sense of morality. Rebecca was watching him carefully, no doubt sensing his hesitation. She seemed to know that her words had taken root in his mind. She wasn't pressing him further, but the unspoken challenge hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Mike, I'm not asking you to understand everything right now," she said finally, her voice smooth, almost coaxing. "But you should understand this, nothing in this world is ever as it seems. What's happening in Glenwood, what's happening with me, it's all part of something much larger. This town? It's not just some sleepy little place on a map. It's about to be at the center of something that will change everything." Mike's gut twisted. "What exactly do you mean by that? What's going to change? And why do you need Glenwood for it?" Rebecca smiled again, but there was a coldness to it, as if she were indulging a child's curiosity. "You'll see soon enough. But first, let me ask you something, Mike. Do you believe in fate?" Mike didn't know how to answer. Fate was a concept he had never really thought much about. He was a man of action, of reason. He liked things he could understand, things he could control. But this felt beyond reason. "I don't know," he muttered, looking down at the file in his hands again. His eyes scanned the name Rebecca Hayes, but it meant nothing to him now. She was no longer just a name. She was something bigger, something more dangerous. "Let me explain it to you this way," Rebecca continued, her voice lowering, becoming more serious. "Fate, or destiny, or whatever you want to call it, has a funny way of working. Things line up, and all of a sudden, you find yourself in the right place at the right time. That's why I'm here. And that's why you're here. You're standing at a crossroads, Mike." He met her gaze again. Her eyes weren't just cold now, they were calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. It unsettled him. He had been a cop for years, and he had met all sorts of people, good, bad, and everything in between. But Rebecca? She was something entirely different. "You're saying I have a choice," Mike said slowly, trying to grasp what she was really offering him. "Yes," she said. "You can walk away. Forget everything. Go back to your patrols, your little world of routine, and never think about this again. But know this: things are happening, Mike. And they will happen whether you're involved or not. You can choose to remain a bystander, but I'm offering you a chance to be part of something much bigger. To make a difference in a way you never imagined." Mike felt his throat tighten. She was talking about power, about control. About decisions that could alter lives, not just in Glenwood, but far beyond. He wasn't a fool. He knew when someone was offering him a deal, and this one wasn't like any he had ever encountered. "But what's in it for me?" Mike asked, his voice rough. "Why would I even consider helping you?" Rebecca's eyes flickered with something, a flash of something darker, more calculating. "Because, Mike, you're not as naive as you pretend to be. I've been watching you. You think I haven't noticed? You're smarter than most people in this town. You see things others don't. You know when things don't add up. You're already a part of this, whether you realize it or not." Mike didn't like where this conversation was going. The more she spoke, the more it felt like she was pulling him into a web, and the more he tried to resist, the tighter it became. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice suddenly more steady. He had to know what would happen if he turned her down. If he walked away from this offer. Rebecca stood up from her chair, moving toward the window. "If you refuse, nothing will happen immediately. You'll go back to your life. But you'll always be wondering, what if? What if you could have made a difference? What if you had been part of something bigger? You'll never know, Mike. And I don't think you'll ever be able to live with that. There was silence between them as she let her words sink in. Mike felt the pressure building. His mind was racing, his emotions conflicted. Was he really ready to step into this world? A world where nothing was as it seemed, where the lines between right and wrong were blurred. I need time to think, he said finally, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe some sort of concession from her, some kind of understanding. But Rebecca didn't give him that. Time won't change anything, Mike, she replied coldly. The clock is ticking. You have 48 hours to make your decision. After that, it won't matter. Mike's heart dropped. The finality of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had 48 hours. 48 hours to decide whether he would take the plunge into a world of power and secrets, or whether he would walk away, forever wondering what might have been. Rebecca turned to leave, her steps measured and purposeful. Think carefully, Mike. The future doesn't wait. With that, she was gone, leaving Mike alone in the interrogation room, the file still clutched in his hands. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. What had he gotten himself into? What was the right choice? And, more importantly, what was the real truth behind all of this? As he stared at the file in front of him, the name Rebecca Hayes now felt like an anchor, holding him in a reality he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The door to the station swung closed with a quiet thud as Rebecca Hayes walked out, her footsteps deliberate, measured. Mike stood frozen for a moment, still trying to piece together everything that had just happened. His head was spinning with the knowledge of who she really was, and the realization of how he'd treated her. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company. A woman with power, influence, and a reputation that reached far beyond Glenwood. And here he was, a small-town cop, trying to figure out where he stood in all of it. Ramirez, ever the skeptic, let out a low chuckle. You really stepped in it this time, Mike. Mike didn't respond at first, still lost in thought. He had felt the weight of Rebecca's words, but it wasn't until now that the full meaning began to settle in. She had chosen to be here, chosen to come into his world, his small-town routine, and test him. She had wanted to see how he would treat someone who didn't fit into his world, someone who didn't look or act like the typical troublemaker he was used to dealing with. But what did that mean? What was she trying to prove? Was she testing him, or was there something deeper to this? Why didn't she just say who she was? Mike asked, rubbing his face with his hands. Why go through all that trouble? Ramirez raised an eyebrow, looking amused but also slightly incredulous. Maybe she wanted to see how you'd treat someone who didn't fit your idea of belonging. Mike sighed, pacing back and forth. Belonging. It was a simple word, but one that hit him hard now. He had assumed Rebecca didn't belong here, she didn't fit the mold of the people he was used to. She wasn't from Glenwood, wasn't someone he'd ever expected to meet. But now, he realized he had made a dangerous assumption. How often do we judge people based on what we see? How often do we fail to recognize the hidden layers that define someone's worth? His bias had been so ingrained that he hadn't even considered that the woman standing in front of him could have been someone entirely different than the image he had painted in his mind. Mike looked toward the door as it creaked open slightly. Rebecca, who had already walked out, paused in the doorway and glanced back at him, her dog trotting along happily beside her. The wagging tail seemed like a small, almost mocking detail in the context of everything that had just transpired. Rebecca's gaze met his, cool and measured. She wasn't angry, wasn't disappointed. Instead, there was something in her eyes that seemed almost amused, as though she found this whole situation rather enlightening. By the way, Officer Bennett, she called, her voice light but with an underlying sharpness, I'm hosting a charity gala for local law enforcement next week. You should come. It might give you a better idea of who belongs where. The words hung in the air as the door clicked shut behind her. Mike stood there, stunned, for a long moment. Who belongs where? The question seemed to echo in his mind. It wasn't just a challenge to his assumptions about her, it was a challenge to everything he thought he knew about his job, his town, his place in the world. Did she just invite you to a gala? Ramirez asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. Mike nodded slowly, still trying to process the words. Yeah. And it sounds like it might be more than just a fancy event. She said something about getting a better idea of who belongs where. Ramirez chuckled, shaking his head. Well, you've got 48 hours, buddy. You gonna take her up on it? Mike didn't answer immediately. He was still thinking about the gravity of what Rebecca had said, about the implications of the world she moved in, and what it would mean for him to step into that world. The invitation wasn't just an offer to attend a fancy event, it was a test. A chance to see if he was ready to step up, to be a part of something larger than the life he knew. But did he want that? A sense of uncertainty lingered in the room, thick like the air before a storm. But as the minutes passed, Mike's resolve began to form. He couldn't ignore what had happened. He couldn't pretend that everything was still the same. The knowledge of who Rebecca Hayes truly was, what she represented, it had shaken him. And now, he had to decide if he was going to keep living in the comfort of his small-town world, or if he was ready to confront whatever lay beyond it. Underscore 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 on. Later that week, Mike stood at the entrance of the Grand Hall, his eyes scanning the crowd. The gala was everything Rebecca had promised and more. It wasn't just a charity event for law enforcement, it was a gathering of the city's most powerful people. Tech moguls, politicians, influential business owners, all of them were here, rubbing elbows in a room filled with extravagant decorations and an air of importance. Rebecca Hayes was the star of the evening, of course, standing at the center of the room with a quiet confidence that turned heads. The kind of person who didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. Mike couldn't help but feel out of place. His uniform, though sharp, felt like a symbol of his small-town life, standing in stark contrast to the polished suits and glamorous gowns around him. He wasn't used to this world, the world of influence, wealth, and power. As he moved through the room, trying to keep a low profile, he spotted Rebecca talking to a few guests, her calm voice carrying effortlessly above the hum of conversation. She caught sight of him from across the room and offered a slight nod. A silent acknowledgement. He hadn't been wrong to come, it seemed. But even as he watched her, Mike felt the same sense of unease settle in his chest. Everything Rebecca had said still played over in his mind, nothing is as it seems. The future doesn't wait. What future was she talking about? And why had she brought him here? Eventually, as the evening wore on, Rebecca made her way over to Mike, her expression as composed as ever. "Officer Bennett," she said smoothly, her smile polite but knowing. "I'm glad you could make it. I hope you're enjoying yourself." Mike nodded, though he wasn't sure if enjoying was the right word. "It's quite the event." Rebecca's smile deepened, almost amused. "You look out of place." "That's all right, though. You're not the only one." Mike's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "You're here because you're at a crossroads, Mike. You've made your decision, even if you don't realize it yet." She paused, looking at him thoughtfully. "You came because you wanted to understand. But sometimes, understanding isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to make a choice whether you want to be a part of the world you've been exposed to, or whether you walk away and keep playing it safe." The weight of her words sank in, and Mike felt a shiver run down his spine. He had made a choice. He had come here, standing in the midst of all this power, to understand what Rebecca had meant. But now, he could feel the tension, the pull between two worlds. The small, safe world he had always known, and the one that lay just beyond his reach, filled with unknowns, risks, and rewards. As the night drew to a close, Rebecca gave him one last look, a glint of something unreadable in her eyes. "Remember, Mike. The choice is always yours. But it's not the choice you make that matters, it's what you do with it." With that, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Mike alone with his thoughts, the weight of the decision pressing down on him harder than ever. He had come here to find answers, but instead, he had been forced to confront a question he wasn't ready to answer. What kind of man did he want to be? As he stood there, the gala swirling around him, Mike knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. As the sounds of the gala continued to buzz around him, Mike stood there for a few moments, lost in thought. Rebecca Hayes had disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the soft echo of her parting words lingering in his mind. He wasn't used to this feeling, this sense of being out of his depth. It was as if everything he had believed about people, about power, and about what really mattered had been turned upside down. Sometimes, the most powerful people don't need to announce who they are, Rebecca had said. Those words hit Mike hard, cutting through the noise of the event and reaching him in a way that he couldn't quite explain. He thought about it for a long time, even as the laughter and chatter of the gala swirled around him. He realized she was right. In a world that was so obsessed with power and status, so quick to judge based on appearance and superficial impressions, it was easy to miss the real story. People were so quick to draw conclusions about others, often based on nothing more than the clothes they wore or the way they carried themselves. But the truth was, it wasn't the loudest voices that had the most power, it was the quiet ones. The ones who didn't feel the need to prove themselves, who didn't need to shout their worth from the rooftops. It was the ones who carried themselves with quiet confidence that had the ability to change things without ever making a fuss. Mike stood there for a while longer, watching the people around him, listening to their conversations, seeing the smiles and the handshakes, the way they all tried to one-up each other, always competing for attention. And in the midst of it all, he thought about Rebecca. She hadn't played by the rules of the world around her. She didn't need to. She had nothing to prove. She carried herself in a way that made others notice without her having to try. She didn't need to talk about who she was, she let her actions and her presence speak for themselves. As the night wore on, Mike walked outside into the cool evening air, the noise of the gala now fading behind him. He took a deep breath, looking up at the sky, the stars scattered across the vastness of the night. It was a peaceful moment, a moment where everything seemed to slow down. And in that stillness, he thought about his own life, his own choices. How often had he judged others based on appearances? How many times had he made assumptions about people before he truly knew them? His job as a police officer had taught him to rely on his instincts, to trust his judgment in situations where others might freeze or hesitate. But now, for the first time, he realized that his instincts had been clouded by his own biases, his own assumptions about what people should look like, how they should act. He had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. Rebecca had been a lesson in that. She had proven that you couldn't judge a person by the way they looked, by the clothes they wore, or by the assumptions you made about their life. No one was ever just what they appeared to be on the surface. And the real strength, the kind of strength that couldn't be measured by bank accounts or power plays, was the kind that came from within. It was the kind of strength that allowed someone to walk through a room full of strangers without needing to assert dominance, without needing anyone else's approval. Mike couldn't help but smile to himself as he thought about the encounter. He realized that what Rebecca had done wasn't about embarrassing him or putting him in his place. She had been testing him, testing his ability to look beyond the surface. She had been trying to show him that true power wasn't about control. It was about self-assurance. It was about knowing who you were without needing to make anyone else see it. The more Mike thought about it, the more he understood. He hadn't just made a mistake by assuming Rebecca didn't belong in Glenwood, he had missed an opportunity. He had been so focused on his role as an officer, his small-town worldview, that he hadn't allowed himself to see beyond it. He had been blind to the bigger picture. And now, standing here, with the cool air surrounding him, Mike felt something shift inside. The fog of judgment and assumption that had clouded his mind was lifting, and in its place, he could see things more clearly. He thought about his own future, about his choices. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, someone who stuck to the rules and believed in justice. But he also realized that true justice wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding people for who they truly were, about looking deeper than the surface and seeing the complexity that lay beneath. In that moment, Mike made a decision. He would change. He would stop judging people based on his preconceived notions. He would start seeing the whole story, not just the part that was easy to understand at first glance. There was more to life than what he had been exposed to, more to people than the labels he had placed on them. He wanted to be the kind of person who looked beyond the obvious, the kind of person who understood that true power came from within. Rebecca Hayes, the quiet, unassuming woman with the dog, had shown him that. She had given him a glimpse into a world he hadn't even known existed, one where power wasn't something to be flaunted, but something that came from confidence and understanding. And though he still didn't fully understand everything about her or the world she moved in, he knew that she had left him with something valuable. A lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As Mike stood there, watching the lights from the gala flicker in the distance, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He didn't need to have all the answers. But he did need to ask better questions. He didn't need to be like everyone else. He just needed to be true to himself. And for the first time in a long time, Mike Bennett felt ready to take on the world, not with arrogance or fear, but with the quiet confidence that came from truly understanding himself. It wasn't about being the loudest person in the room or making a spectacle of himself. It was about moving through life with purpose, knowing who he was, and letting that inner strength guide him. In a world full of noise, it was the quiet ones who had the most to say. And Mike knew, now more than ever, that it was the quiet confidence that would carry him through. As he walked away from the gala, Mike's thoughts were clearer than they had ever been. He had learned something important that night. The real power wasn't in how loudly you could speak, but in how quietly you could stand your ground. And with that realization, Mike knew he was ready to face whatever came next.